Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Steinman, treasurer of OWA, and someone keenly interested in the world of M&A. So happy to welcome you to the M&A session today. First off, let me introduce our session sponsor, Northwest Farm Credit, and Randy Burrell.
Thank you, Andy. I was so impressed how much Andy loves wine. I was like, why do you love wine so much? And he said, I have my Rieslings. I just want to thank the Oregon Wine Growers Association for putting on another great show. It's a resounding. We're also happy to be here in person. Virtual is great, but it does not replace the in-person connections we've made. Northwest Farm Credit Services has had another strong year of earnings and growth this year and have returned 1.25% back to our customer members in the form of patronage just last month. We've had a number of crop insurance customers who have benefited from coverage this last year and during the last few years in the challenging times that we've all experienced. Our appraisal team, hot off the press, just introduced a 10-year land value trend and current market analysis. If anybody's interested, please let us know. And we've been fortunate to be involved in a number of buy-sell transactions over the past year, and really looking forward to this timely and relevant topic, and looking forward to hearing the perspectives of the panel today. Thank you.
And thank you, Randy, and Northwest Farm Credit. We appreciate your support of OWA and the Oregon Wine Symposium. So this is going to be different than a lot of these kind of presentations previously. We have a group today that are not the M&A advisors, people like me that you've heard from a lot, but people who have been involved in transactions or facilitate transactions. So let me introduce, going from my right, your left, Craig Williams of Ex Novo Vineyard, Matt Tackett, a realtor in the region who does quite a bit of transactional work in this area, Lauren Johnson from Davis Wright Tremaine, Arthur Kalita, and hopefully Arthur says only good things because I was involved in his transaction last year, and finally Jess Lyon, who everyone out there knows. So I'm looking forward to learning something, as I'm sure you all are.
Thank you so much, Andy. Northwest Farm Credit, definitely, we appreciate you financing a lot of good deals out there. Just to set the stage just a little bit further, we're going to talk a lot about really the experience of doing transactions, what it's like to kind of prepare for a transaction, live through a transaction, and what to expect. And the focus of most of our discussion will be about vineyard and kind of smaller winery deals. As some of you in the audience know, the sort of bigger winery transactions take on a whole nother life of our own, and we'd be happy to delve into some of that maybe on a different session or one-on-ones afterwards. But that's sort of the nature of it. And each of the panelists here, as Andy said, have really interesting and different perspectives on this. So I guess and we're going to keep this very conversational, so I'm going to ask a lot of questions. We're going to discuss together, and then at the end we'll have time for questions too. So if you've got questions for any of us or observations for the room, we're happy to field those at the end as well. But maybe first, starting with Craig, would like you just to share a little bit about just sort of your role and experience in vineyard and winery transactions. How many have you bought and sold? What do you do?
Sure. Thank you. Great to be here. It's great to see everyone out in the audience. I confess that my experience, quite honestly, is many years ago or decades ago when I started out basically in wine production, but soon thereafter found myself going out with my president of marketing and sales to look for property for our owners. So I was involved in a company for many decades down in California with a private family or private company. And that's where I purchased. I was more of a buyer than a seller. I've also worked with a publicly traded company, and so I've been involved as a buyer there. And I've worked with a number of advisors. Some are here in the audience today, and kicked tires on properties with my former associates. I would say the biggest challenge that I experienced wasn't with the seller of the vineyards that we were interested in or the land that we were interested in. It was the owner of the company that I had to convince that this was a good buy, it was a good purchase. And so I was a neophyte. This is not something that I specialized in, but over the course of numerous transactions in Napa Valley as well as Sonoma Coast and then elsewhere, I've just learned to look for certain underlying assets and valuations, also issues or concerns that may arise during transactions. But my experience mostly has been with vineyard acquisition or vineyard land acquisition.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Matt?
Happy to be here. My name is Matt Tackett from Oregon Vineyard Property. A lot of you probably know my colleague Peter Bowman, who is enjoying his time in Mexico. And him and I started working together about 8 years ago. We just happened to be in the same office, and he was looking for help. At that time, I was sort of angling towards a career in commercial real estate. And we hit it off, and that was 8 years ago. So have been, doing quite a few transactions, mainly in the Willamette Valley. And it's been fun. I've learned a lot over the years. Studied a little bit at Chemeketa in the beginning just to kind of get my bearings. And now I'm making a little bit of wine on the side with Jay Sommers, and just love the Oregon wine industry and, helping people find a good fit property-wise.
Thank you. Lauren?
Hi, Lauren Johnson. I'm an attorney at Davis Wright and really help clients, both buyers and sellers, with purchasing or selling their vineyard, winery, helping with the legal due diligence, so title review, survey, negotiating of the purchase and sale agreement, and also just leases as well that can, folks are needing either post-closing or after they purchase the property and are looking for future activity.
Yep. And Arthur?
Thanks, Jess, for the invitation, and thank all of you for participating. So I'm Arthur Kalita. I have experience selling one vineyard, and that was the sale last year of Kalita Vineyard that I founded to the Saco Blosser winery. Just a little overview of Kalita Vineyard. In 1998, I bought land in Yamhill, Oregon, in the Yamhill-Carlton AVA. Was raw land, so planted in 2000, 2001, but 22 acres of Pinot Noir, and enjoyed many, many vintages and many wonderful relationships with winemakers, many of whom made single vineyard, Kalita Vineyard Pinots. The 22 acres was farmed from the inception by Results Partners, because I lived the whole time in New York and only visited here. It was farmed on a live certified sustainable basis and had a unique bowl-shaped vineyard which gave us several different terroirs over the 22 acres. And we decided that it was time, we'll get into this later, it was time to sell last year, and had a very successful transaction with Saco Blosser.
So I thought what we do today as we kind of progress through the conversation is sort of start with sort of what it's like to get to that moment that it's time to do a transaction of some time kind of putting the team and then the deal ultimately together to get to negotiating key terms in an offer, that sort of build up to a transaction and closing through diligence and other pre-closing work, and then actually what it's like to close a deal and for sellers run home with a check. I'm also going to do a proud colleague moment. I think Lauren probably transacts more agricultural land work as a lawyer than probably any lawyer in the West Coast. Besides working on vineyard transactions, Lauren works on lots of large orchard transactions in citrus and table fruit, tree fruit, stone fruit, nuts, you name it. So Lauren's nuts, for working with me probably. Arthur, you specifically mentioned some important kind of personal conversations your family had about this is the moment. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's important that, well, I guess first of all, one thing I would like to say, I'll probably fill the time with some bromides I learned over my 30 years of financial experience doing a lot of M&A transactions that had nothing to do with vineyards or wineries. But one thing I always say is if you're a seller, you really ought to be selling when buyers are buying. And after a complete absence of buying activity in 2020, my sense in early 2021 was that the market was likely to open up again, along with all of the good news on vaccinations and COVID getting somewhat under control. And so with our family, we just engaged in a discussion over really, I'd say 2 to 3 months about, dinner table discussion about, is it time to sell? Is it a good idea to sell? Am I, after I sell, am I going to be a real problem with my minute-to-minute supervision of my wife and family and, for lack of other distractions? And, it was important to have all the discussions, get it all out and make a decision, because I think once you're involved in a sale process, you ought not to turn back unless you have a really good reason, because you can lose credibility on that. So we had a lot of discussion, and we engaged Metis LLC as a financial advisor, but even before engaging them, we had at least 2 or 3 Zoom calls to discuss strategy, expectations, valuation expectations, and process. And I think it's important before you take your decision to understand all of those things as best you can.
And Craig, maybe a little bit from the buyer side, what sort of the drivers for buyers sort of, maybe some are always perpetually looking for the right opportunity, but were there sort of the primary drivers for potential acquisitions that caused you to be out looking for the right deal?
Sure. Well, one is location in terms of site, soil, product line, new variety, growth or scalability, regionality in terms of climate, growing conditions. I mean, I think there's an interesting thing happening right now with Oregon in that there's a strong gaze from California, from the south looking here, looking northward, I think in part because of climate change. So those are big factors, I think, that come into play in terms of a buyer. So looking for properties that align with the company's growth or profitability are drivers that we look at, or that I've looked at for my former businesses, and that is, it seems to me that demand, scarcity, location, those are big factors that come into play.
And Matt, when we were having some of our kind of prep conversations, we talked a little bit about sort of the various, if you will, broad brush categories of buyers, from kind of lifestyle buyers to maybe local buyers or local businesses who are kind of doing maybe a roll-up of some additional brands or acreage onto sort of the larger strategics that are, here domestically or now internationally, or kind of the pure play financial buyers. I know you and Peter interact especially a lot with lifestyle buyers. How do you find those? How do those moments come across?
Well, it usually starts with a dream, and they call us up, and there's a lot of romance in, I would say, that sector. And we would typically define that sector as usually it's sort of a residential blend with a commercial ag component. And so that can, financing-wise, create some difficulties, and it's important, to get them in the right loan structure if they are financing out of the gate there. But, you know, for industry to industry sale, they're not going to want a house, as we discussed. And so that can oftentimes be sort of a detriment, and just you lose most just purely business buyers. But there are a lot of people who, you know, it's not necessarily about making money, it's about having the vineyard, experiencing, you know, the seasonal cycle, the farming, and really just having, you know, their own label if it's small, usually a custom crush. And it's, you know, it's definitely a big component of the market just because of how many vineyards have a home on site. So we do run into it quite a bit.
And Lauren, if, let's say, you know, one of our clients says, you know, I think we're going to be approaching a deal pretty soon, what sort of jumps to mind that they should start doing to just get ready for that moment, kind of pre-offer?
Yeah, I think the big obstacle that we see sometimes with sellers is just deal fatigue. It's, you know, they think they sign the LOI and they're ready to move forward and move to closing, but before you get to that place and really to set yourself up for success, I think it's making sure that your contracts are in order, that you know, operating expenses on the property, farming costs, what are your water reports look like. Also thinking about generally the property lines in Oregon don't necessarily match how the vineyard's been planted. And so some of your vines may be on neighboring property and you've had a great relationship with that neighbor. And so thinking long-term, well, I'm gonna sell that property, and maybe, you know, putting in a formal agreement in place prior to selling the property and marketing it would be a good idea. And then just thinking through environmental impact as well. Just, you know, are folks using your property to get to another property? What are the access issues that you come up with? So just broad questions to kind of think of ahead of before you actually enter into the LOI, so that way you can be prepared to answer some of the questions that buyers are going to ask.
I'm just going to add, you know, as a winery buyer, I think that one of the qualities or metrics that wineries often look for is some consistency in their product line. And while it may not be 100% their own estate vineyards, having a certain percentage of grapes that they can rely on each and every year for their label is very, very valuable. Having consistency in the marketplace is something that's huge and very significant and important. And so that's one of the, I think, a key driver for wineries to be looking for vineyards or land, to make sure that as they make wine that they have that consistency, because it can be tough, as you all know, if you're selling grapes or buying grapes. It can be a minefield out there at times, and so that's back and forth. Moving around doesn't always translate well on the shelf in the bottle. So having your own source of grapes is very valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and consistent too with grape contracts. You know, some of these agreements have early termination rights and the cost that comes with it. So thinking about, are they evergreen contracts? Will you be able to terminate them? And so the timing too as to when you sell your vineyard is going to be key, I think, as well as you're kind of planning going into harvest and then after what that's going to look like.
Yep. A couple things I want to unpack there. Arthur, I know you had some thoughts about, you know, information that you would save that was valuable for you in the marketing process.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is another bit of advice that I learned the hard way, which is try to keep better records than I did over 20 plus years of ownership before deciding to sell, because it makes the process a lot easier. But also recognize that, as Lauren said, once you're in the due diligence process, it is intensive. So the extent to which you can anticipate that before you ever even get into the market and organize your documentation and records, it's very useful. In our particular case, we probably spent, the deal was a relatively fast deal. We were selling just 22 acres of Pinot Noir that was planted, additional vacant land, about 3.5 acres of which was plantable, and then a building and farm equipment and some incidental stuff. So it was a quite straightforward transaction. But there's still a lot of stuff that you should keep. And a simple thing that I didn't do as good a job on as I might have is to keep library wines from your vineyard over the years, particularly if you have single vineyard wines produced. Try to keep them from every vintage, because if you're dealing with a buyer, it sure helps if they can sit down and taste the wines and see the consistency from year to year. Or in our case, since we were always working with 5 or 6 different winemakers in a year, to see some of the different expressions from the vineyard that winemakers would tease out in their winemaking process, because you never know what you're going to hit upon that's going to strike some buyer as saying, oh, that's really the kind of Pinot Noir or whatever grape variety they want to produce from a vineyard that they're acquiring. So it's important to try to organize yourself as best you can before you start. I would say the other thing that I didn't do a good enough job on was keeping record of all of the harvest dates. I had pretty much the harvest dates and the yields, but I didn't have all of the lab reports, the pH and the bricks to go with that for over some 16 vintages that we had. And I think it's just useful to have that, because it helps in the selling process.
Matt, is there other things that you really would like to see sellers especially bring to you pre-deal?
Yeah, yields are really important. Ideally, the yields from the last 3 to 5 years. Where are the grapes going? Is it an acreage contract or a tonnage contract? And what are the prices on those? And that's good info just to be able to present to a prospective buyer from sort of a high level. If you're not in contract, you're probably not going to be sharing your grape contract, but you want to tease out enough info to show them it's a compelling opportunity. And, from the buyer side, it's pretty similar. So they're going to, we would be providing a due diligence checklist for them to kind of work through. And so we can just work that in reverse with the seller. If there is a winery component, then obviously operating expenses and revenue are going to come into play, and sometimes a lease to work through. Or if there's a vineyard lease, is it assumable if it's not owned? Those are some things that could likely come up.
All of which ultimately are affecting value, right? Before we talk a little bit about, value and how to anticipate valuation, I'd like maybe, again, for you explore a little bit your thoughts about, should I go to an open listing, right, where they can go to, your Oregon Vineyard website and, I'm out there, versus a pocket listing on a real estate transaction, to a more kind of super confidential process even further on, with an investment banker or the like? Like, what are some of the considerations that you, that you take into account?
Well, number one would be staff. If there is staff, are they going to feel like, my job security is in question if this is for sale? So typically, if there's any staff in play, you're going to sort of trend towards confidential. The detriment with confidential is lack of exposure. You don't know if that unicorn buyer you never connected with just never saw the property, because it's a direct line of communication between the broker and the potential buyers that they think are a good fit. Plus, the seller will typically have their own list of potential buyers to work through. But it really comes down to exposure is typically going to be better, but it can be a real negative in terms of affecting your fruit contracts, affecting your staff, potentially losing your winemaker. So with a bigger operation, it's usually not good. With a plantable piece of dirt or vineyard, it's usually a good idea.
Yeah, and then certainly for wineries, when you're concerned about impacts on distributor relations and customers and all that, it almost has to be, a very kind of confidential and tightly wound process. Arthur, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of what your go-to-market experience was?
Yes, and maybe it was just because it was, I was more comfortable with it based on my own personal experience over the years, but I chose the traditional M&A route, even though it wasn't a very complex deal. And so just to cover, for those who don't know quickly, the process there, the way we did it was the advisor prepared a list. In our case, it was about 75 to 80 prospective buyers, some of which were lifestyle buyers, but more tilted towards strategic buyers, both in Oregon, obviously California, Washington State, France, and a couple other countries. Then we started with a very simple anonymous teaser, which was sent out to all of those buyers or prospective buyers. And then those that were interested had to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that it then became a confidential process for those who did sign. From there, once they signed the NDA, they could receive the confidential information memorandum that really was setting the stage for all the things we had to do in due diligence. So in our case, it was about a 15-page description of the vineyard, the deal, the wines that were made over the years. We had 5 years worth of financials, as well as 5 years of information about fruit sales contracts. As I said, in each vintage, we usually had about 6 different buyers, somewhat different terms, but quite similar over the years. And then, of course, for those out-of-market buyers, there was another 15 pages on the info memo that was the Oregon story and the AVA story and things like that. So it's a fairly comprehensive document, given the simplicity of the deal.
Craig, how many of those would you get a week, and how many would you sign NDAs on?
In my recent past, quite a few, at least. Well, I wasn't every week, but I think we were maybe every month looking at something. I would just say, my experience was that using a broker has been the main process by which we acquired vineyard or vineyard land. There's one anecdote I'll share, maybe two, that in the private wine company that I worked for, after years of agonizing over a production line of wine that we had attempted to make a success, and it wasn't, it was failing, we finally convinced the owner that we should sell the brand, the label, and the vineyards that were located in Monterey County, by the way. And it was a relatively large piece of land. There's, not surprising, a lot of emotion tied up in labels, especially if the owner was involved with Gerald Asher, who's a wine writer of Gourmet, to come up with the name. And so he was furious to find out that a sales timeline of decreasing sales or decreasing revenue meant that the brand had zero value, right? Had zero value to any potential buyer, and that really what we were looking at was an asset play or an asset sale. And it took us probably a year and a half to calm down before we put it on the market as basically a vineyard for sale. And by the way, here's the label if you want it. So these are some of the expectations that I think everyone should realize going into a potential sale or a purchase, that there are metrics that are involved, and you need to really be careful of checking your emotion at the door when you're working with a lot of people. They're trying to get a deal done, and the deal's the right thing to do, right? It's the right thing to get on with your lives and focus on what's working and let go of the things that don't work.
Yep. I'm going to insert myself, go from moderator to editorial comment here. When it comes to those sale teasers and those pitch documents, make sure what you say in there is in fact true, because the buyers will be bidding against that. And even though it's not at the time, part of the definitive binding contract yet. They'll have based their value on that. So if they get into diligence and find that when you said fully developable site, and that meant that the buyer has to go seek a conditional use permit and spend a lot of time with Yamhill County or Jackson County or whatever, and it's going to cost time and money, uncertainty. Uncertainty creates risk, and risk creates discount. And you'll see that come back at you on a retrade on purchase price if you've just overstated your case. So those are certainly promotional documents, but don't be so promotional you can't back it out.
Just have one other comment that there are various documents that come up in the course of the transaction that I think we'll be talking about. So in our case, we started off with a letter of intent, which is really a binding offer, subject to any conditions in that LOI and due diligence, of course. And then that's followed by due diligence and then the purchase and sale agreement. And I would just advise that you spend a few hours and sit down and read some sample letters of intent and purchase and sale agreements so that you're familiar with what's in them and the terminology, and so you're not completely surprised when questions come up or when you're in the negotiation process.
In addition to the panel I've got here, I took the occasion to email a couple folks that we've worked with that have been through transactions the last few years and solicited some comments, which are some of them, frankly, quite entertaining. One I can't read at all to you. A couple of them short and sweet in terms of this sort of marketing process. In what is it, 8-9 words? Expect to have a lot of tire kickers, right? So there are going to be a lot of people looking, especially after a teaser, where a property isn't identified. They'll sign an NDA and then come out and kind of kick tires, so to speak, and find out that it might not be right. And then let's turn a little bit to valuation. Another one that I really liked was the following statement. Try to take the emotion out of your valuation while retaining positive emotions about your business. There's like a little Zen moment for you. But let's talk about sort of expectations of value kind of prior negotiations. How did you, Arthur, how did you go about anticipating what you'd sell? And Matt, I'm interested in sort of how you, get to a sense of realistic expectations of a value range.
Well, I mean, for one thing, pretty much all of the transactions in this business are not disclosed in terms of what the prices are. So, word is always around and there's always a range. So you have to be working within a range. And I guess in my case, I had just kind of followed the market over the years so that when the financial advisor presented a typical kind of range of valuation, low, medium, high, I wasn't surprised. And so I said, okay, now I know that I can probably trust the financial advisor not to try to appeal to my ego by throwing a number out there that is not achievable. So that goes back to the notion that make sure you're grounded and you have reasonable expectations as to what you are going to get.
So for the asset valuation, we like to just break it out by component, starting with the bare land price. And there's quite a bit of variation within that from AVA to AVA. And then
Can I put in a quick plug right there? Northwest Farm Credit Service, thank you for sponsoring. And the AVA specific land values, they've got it at the table out there before they break it down. Sorry, go ahead.
Very helpful. Yes.
That was not planned, but team, way to go.
And so that's going to be, on a big parcel, that number can often sort of swing the most, whereas the vineyard improvement, if it's self-rooted and has health issues, it's not going to be very valuable, but if it's healthy and productive, oftentimes the value will be replacement cost. And that could be, these days around $35,000 to $40,000 all in to get you developed a third leaf. And so from there, it's just, breaking out the other components of the asset, for a home or tasting room or whatnot, looking at both replacement cost and comparable sales. And then if there is a business element, you know, it kind of boils down to the success of the business. And if there's a lot of inventory and, you know, it's been a challenge to work through the inventory, then it's probably not going to be as compelling to a buyer. If it's a going concern, the distribution's good, you know, that's going to be a compelling opportunity. So that's, you know, kind of it in a nutshell. Break out the line item of the assets, and then, you know, for the business, it becomes a little more amorphous.
I would
Craig,
also
yeah,
add
you please go.
just the purchase price allocation and talking to your CPAs early and getting that in front of folks, because that's always the last minute thing that comes up, and it takes a while sometimes to negotiate, so.
Craig, I know you've got some thoughts about people who talk about EBITDA multiples all the time.
No, well, I was just thinking about transactions and valuations, but yeah, I would just be careful about coming to someone, whether it's an M&A advisor or a broker, and saying, well, I want 20 times EBITDA, right? Whatever EBITDA is, right? I mean, well, we know what EBITDA, but and that's more for wineries, not so much for vineyards, but for wineries, and it doesn't really work that way. But I know that's the language or the lingo that is talked about all over the land when it comes to deals that close. Are you amazed at this EBITDA multiple that someone just received? But I just think, you know, in my instance, my little vineyard here in Oregon has a home on it, and so I realized that if I were to sell that would, which I'm not planning to do, but if I were, that would, I think, narrow it down to a certain type of buyer, because I know that larger businesses or publicly traded companies, they're really not interested in a home. They don't even want to run it as an Airbnb, as lucrative as you may think it is. That's just for most buyers, that's a pain. I think the other thing is it's important to line up to know what your zoning is and underlying parcels. If you can spin off that house, or you can spin off improvements that a buyer doesn't want and put them onto a different parcel, or even do some lot line adjustment with a neighbor pre-sale, I think that can be really valuable and actually enhance the deal. A deal that I did in Sonoma, buying land, I didn't know what these were, but they're called certificates of compliance that were issued just after the Civil War, and they were small little land holdings, and I went back and perfected those into 2-acre lot or larger sizes that you could build a home on, and then I swapped those for 90 acres of land across the street where we put more vineyards on for the winery. So underlying lot lines or parcels, if you have them and they're existing and they're legal, can be very valuable. So don't dismiss those, either as a seller or as a buyer. Those things can really come into play, and you can leverage those to your advantage going forward. And sometimes we just don't think about those things. So easements, water, all of that really can roll up and be very significant in a sale.
As we build up into sort of the deal terms, besides, you know, price and how long a diligence period is going to be and all those things, there's all these other little strings attached, sometimes leasebacks, what happens to grapes, what happens to home sites and things like that. Also, Lauren, we spoke a little bit about, you know, sort of timing relative to the growing year, farming costs, farming transitions. Do you want to share, like, sort of how we see that dealt with most commonly?
Yeah, so I think, you know, when you're thinking about harvest and when you're going to sell your property, you know, farming costs, if you're going to do it around harvest time, and Matt can provide more information on this too, but buyers are going to want to wait until the harvest is done and then start taking over operations after. So when you market and when you close is really important, and it impacts the farming cost reimbursement that will go into that purchase price. I think too, as far as diligence, you're going to get third-party consultants involved. Title companies can take 10 days to get you your title reports, and then surveyors can take anywhere to 20 to 25 business days to actually get the survey done. If you are going to do financing, depending on what the LTV value is, Some title companies will actually need to research the property back to when the United States granted the property to the owner. And so that can take 3 months. If the LTV value is above or below 60%, then it's only going to take 3 weeks for the title company to prepare the report. So it's just being mindful of, what type of diligence is the buyer going to want to do, and how long are those folks going to take to get you the reports that they need.
I feel like I could do this next question rapid fire. Like, diligence nightmares, go.
Structure on property line.
Underground storage tanks.
Unknown depiction of a road crossing the property.
Oh, my goodness. Reservoir in part built on neighbor's property.
Burial grounds.
Burial grounds, yes.
Oh, yeah, archaeological, that's good. Archaeological grounds on property, yeah.
Or just a, traditional gravesite. We had a transaction last year where there was a gravesite and you disclose it, and the seller said, well, it's, the previous owner's grandmother, and the buyer said, okay, well, we will just leave that in oak trees.
Prescriptive easement.
Yes.
You don't know that someone's using the property that you're about to buy, and they have a legal right to do so.
I'll throw in one: irrigation without a water right.
Yeah.
I would say mineral rights too, oil and gas leases.
Reserved.
Yeah.
We can do a few more. I know we can.
Yeah, with the irrigation, a lot of times what we see is, somewhat the owner has gotten an establishment permit, and then they just leave the irrigation in place and, might use it when they want to or when need be. But, water rights overall, I think, are a big thing to, do a deep dive into as a buyer or a seller, because oftentimes, the owner will say, oh, we have water rights, and, there might be a slip up in there where they haven't filed, their use, or a lot of different things can lapse. And so it's worth talking to the Oregon Department of Water Resources and talk to the local water master and really, get their view on the property.
Great, guys. So
I,
you're
no,
gonna
no,
list
no,
a
I'm,
rapid fire
I'm
now.
thinking of all these.
Yeah, go. Let's
pieces.
go.
No, I know no one would do that up here in the Pacific Northwest, but basically in violation of the use permit.
Yeah.
Right? And in terms of production and or even marketing, sales, traffic, all of those things,
Yep.
they roll up, and that can be a nightmare.
Yep.
And that's a big deal down south. I mean, that's really being policed very heavily.
Yeah. A couple more that come to mind for me, like old dump sites that were just sort of covered up. Somebody else, might not even been yours. A prior owner had a dump site and they dug a hole and threw a bunch of garbage in it, and now it's underneath a bunch of blackberries, maybe never to be seen again.
Conditional use permits that are personal to the current property owner.
Yeah.
Correct.
Residential tenants with no written lease, like you want to buy a land and there's a tenant there with no lease, that can be a problem. I think we could probably go on, but we didn't talk about vineyard health.
No, we didn't.
You're a soil health guy, site guy.
Yeah, I'm more of a site guy. I was telling Matt earlier he should just take this question, but look, it's important. But my experience has been more in looking at the site and the location, more so than the existing vines, because in some cases, certainly down in California, the vineyard that we were buying was not in great shape. And while there was a valuation put on the vineyard, I discounted that quite heavily because I knew that if we were to close the sale, we would go in and replant right away. Now, some companies don't do that, or some buyers won't do that. They'll want to continue the life of that vineyard. It's important to them. I've just, I don't know, it's just my situation that I've been developing more vineyards than I've been trying to sustain them. And it's just, part of it's just my focus. But it is important, and there's all sorts of problems that you're all aware of in the vineyards that can be adverse to a deal.
I would say, as a seller, just kind of be honest with yourself. If you know of, a health condition with the vineyard, the buyer is likely going to find it, and so it's best to just disclose what you know. And it sort of always seems to be changing. 2-3 years ago, it was trunk disease, and it seemed like a lot of sellers, they were telling us, we do not have trunk disease, this is a vigor issue or whatever it is. And now maybe it's, red blotch or leaf roll or whatever. There's always going to be, health issues. And then from the buyer side of it, what we do is just advise them to connect with a professional viticulturalist, walk the vineyard with them, get an outside opinion that's not from the seller, it's not from me, it's just from someone who doesn't really have a dog in the fight, to really, get an unbiased opinion of the vineyard. It's sort of like, you're going to do a building inspection. It's worth doing the same thing for the vineyard.
I might say a word too about trademarks, and even some of you, may think, well, I have a vineyard, so I don't really have a wine brand. But if someone's been using your vineyard designate with your permission, I hope, on their wine label, that's a trademark in wine and is worth something. So something ahead of time you can do to clear and protect and potentially register that trademark. Certainly it's personal, Arthur, if you're selling the family name. What was it? Was that part of your family conversation?
Yes and no, because I guess we didn't really think that it was going to be important. It turned out it was in the acquisition something that was important, and so the buyer was buying the name and the intellectual property. And I guess I only thought about it after the offer was made, and so then it becomes important as to what you think about the buyer and what they're going to do with your name, because it is to a certain extent your reputation and the brand that you've built. So you need to anticipate that. I probably did not.
And then just a couple of other things. We're focusing mostly on the vineyard side today, but certainly if you get into selling, wineries, there's whole investigations of wine inventory, bulk and finished wine, quality, volumes, what are your distribution relationships, so you're locked into a bunch of franchise relationships that buyers are going to want to transition out of and could cost money. Sort of good reporting and data on both retail, tasting room, and direct-to-consumer sales. How does the club look? Do you have the rights to use the club and sell the club information? Compliance, wine library certifications, all things that are going to come up and really drive value for you.
One thing, Jesse, and Matt mentioned this earlier, and it wasn't involved in our deal, but in other deals that I did over the years, is that if you are selling a winery and you have employees and you have, the relationships in the marketplace, you have to think very carefully about confidentiality and the fact that word almost always leaks out, so that you have to be prepared to deal with that and prepared to deal with employees if you have them.
I was just going to add this earlier about M&A advisors. I think that they can provide a great value and service as well, in terms of, especially for wineries, but vineyards too. This may be a surprise, but they're very well connected with a lot of potential buyers. And they will have a list. I mean, there are buyers that they speak to, or companies, both publicly traded or private, that say, hey, we're looking for this. If it comes up, let us know. And it might be a 10-year search, but they're on that list, so they know that. They have that list of potential buyers for you, or if you. And the other thing that was interesting to me, and it's where I think this gets into, we sometimes don't think about the value of the business or why someone would be interested in your business. There was a recent sale to an offshore company that was selling, I think, almost 50% of their product here in the States through a subsidiary business. But what they really wanted to do, so it was a business-to-business transaction, what they really wanted to do was have a business-to-consumer transaction. In other words, they wanted to sell their products DTC, right? And they couldn't do it unless they owned a brick-and-mortar establishment here in this country, right? So they actually had to own a winery, and they completed the deal, and that was important to them. It wasn't the only part, but that's where it's good to get people that are experts that know involved, that can really help you understand and how to position and to really get a good valuation for what you're looking for, what you're seeking.
Yep. We've got about 5 more minutes left maybe, and then we'll turn it to questions if anybody wants to kind of be thinking about those. Lauren, you want to talk a little bit, we've kind of focused on the high-level deal points, but we get to the definitive agreement to maybe take a few weeks to negotiate. And then we hear people talk about schedules and disclosures. Do you want to sort of talk about what that process is like and why it's important?
Yeah, so typically in your purchase and sale agreement as a seller, you're going to make a ton of reps and warranties that the buyer is going to want to see. And so your best friend is going to be your disclosure schedule and letting the buyer know, hey, I can't make this rep and warranty to you because of X, Y, and Z. It protects you in the long run, so that way there's not claims that come up later on. But it does take a lot of time, and again, it goes back to being prepared to sell the property, making sure that you're aware of where things stand, and so that way the disclosure schedules can come together fairly quickly. You'll also you'll negotiate the closing documents and attach them as exhibits to the purchase and sale agreement, so that's going to be your deeds, it's going to be your bill of sale, assignment assumption of agreements. During the diligence period too, you're going to need to reach out to folks if consent is required to assign any of the contracts, and so that can take a little bit of time as well. And so all this needs to happen, sometimes you even sign the agreement, but then also during the diligence period, so that way your buyer doesn't walk. And then closing typically will happen a certain number of days after the diligence period is expired. And that's really just coordinating as far as making sure that signatures are signed. Deeds, you have to actually use a wet signature and in front of a notary, and so sometimes you get into so-and-so's traveling to Hawaii, so we need to make sure that the deed gets signed before they take off, or we need to change the notary block because they are signing in Hawaii. And so it's just coordinating that and making sure that you stay on top of things so you don't miss the closing deadline. And then wire instructions, et cetera, with the title company. So there's a lot of, detail steps that need to happen towards the end. And again, that's another reason why the purchase price allocation is really important, because title companies will need that for the settlement statement. And so more just a piece of it, but it's very important.
I wanted to comment on the purchase price allocation because it typically is a simple exhibit in the purchase and sale agreement, but it's an important one because it's going to drive the tax implications for seller and buyer, and how you allocate, in this case of a vineyard sale, the purchase price between land, buildings, equipment, and then now AVA, which has become fairly important these days, which is like a form of goodwill, is also critical. And it's wise to get started on that early because to a certain extent, from a seller's perspective, a lot of that allocation will be driven by what you paid for the land, what you did in terms of improvements, what you've depreciated, what you've not depreciated. And so it's a time-consuming process, and as I know Jess advised in our transaction, it's much, much better to have buyer and seller agree on the purchase price allocation rather than to have their own allocations.
Yeah, you basically become an audit flag if buyer and seller aren't agreeing on the allocation. Any other kind of comments sort of about the closing process, things that surprise folks?
You probably won't sit across the table from the other party. We had discussed that earlier. Yeah, there's a lot of electronic signatures that are done these days. If you buy with cash, you actually can DocuSign to close. With how Oregon is structured, sometimes that throws people off, that you may never have a face-to-face with the seller or buyer, depending on what side you're on. And I guess with closing remotely, something to keep in mind is if you meet a mobile notary, if you're not able to sign electronically, then they have to overnight those papers back. And so it's just kind of buffering the time frame a little. Yep.
Yeah, just be patient. It takes time, and be prepared for extensions.
Yeah, one of the comments I got from, the anonymous commenters was that you're basically selling your business and buying one too really becomes a full-time job while you're trying to run your business as well. So just be prepared for that and know you're going to lean hard on other team members who maybe are going to do other things to keep the wheels in motion while somebody's got to focus on this deal. We've got just a few minutes left for questions. Anybody want to questions, observations? We've got Andy and probably Eric. I know Kevin and George are in the room. You guys have got lots of experience too. Anything you guys want to chime in, we'd love to hear from you too. I can see a shadow. Uh-oh.
Hey, Arthur.
Did we turn off Arthur's mic?
Thanks for selling me your vineyard. One thing I just for everyone.
Buyer's remorse.
No, none at all. But one thing that we are in what you would call a business buyer. We're not looking for a house. But one thing that meant a lot to me, Arthur, about your property, that it wasn't disclosed. I found this out on a title search, and this was a property you bought from Mark Benoit. And so the pedigree of the vineyard was something that you may want to tell your people to put on the documents and to tell people that. Because not a lot of people might not know Mark Benoit, but Mark Benoit to me is a god. So, he was a big deal in the wine industry. So to know that kind of pedigree just adds to the potential of the property. So I would just encourage you to maybe, if you have other clients, include all that stuff. Because to some of us buyers, that stuff is like, wow, that was a Mark Benoit development. So just wanted to say that.
Well, thanks, Alex. I think in light of that, because I didn't disclose that, I think we should reprice the deal.
More wine, right?
Yeah, he was kind enough to include some wine in the deal over 5 years. Maybe we could just up the number of cases.
Any other questions or comments from anybody? Or any of the panelists up here? Last closing thoughts?
Well, kind of on that same point, to a buyer, it is important where the fruit is going. If you don't have vineyard designate bottling for them to try, the quality or how they perceive the quality of where the grapes are going is going to be a big factor. Just something to keep in mind on, negotiating grapes and where they end up.
Arthur started with a little bit about your family, and certainly for family businesses like these are emotional transactions. Buyers will do things with your vineyard or your winery that you wouldn't have done. They may change things that you had just made perfect and done it there. I remember when I sold a house, my wife and I had rescued a giant spruce tree in our front yard, and for years we had like little inoculation, syringes in the side of this tree. We sold the house, and 2 weeks later they cut it down, and we still drive by it, and we're like, where's our tree? And then they planted another tree in the same spot. That's going to happen with your business, and some of that you just kind of have to have a thick skin and thank them for the check and spend your money doing other things. Andy?
I wanted to try in one thing along the lines of what you're just saying. As a seller, it's best to also know what things are important to you that may not be monetary. If you have a certain kind of business and want to ensure that the buyer is continuing that kind of business, you better know that at the start, and versus guess as to what your parameters are.
Yeah, we've got another question, comment?
I have a total newbie question, because it's a family business, and we've never sold anything. I've sold a lot of personal real estate, and I know what the costs are involved in that, but I've heard rumors of what the costs are involved in commercial real estate transactions with vineyards and that sort of thing. Can you sort of speak to that? I've heard numbers like 30%, I've heard less than that, and if you could just talk to that a little bit.
Do you want to start sort of with success fees that you guys are seeing or asking for? Maybe you don't want to say that, Matt, I don't know.
It's not that much different than residential. I mean, there might be a small premium for they're more complex by nature. But, of course, a lot of it is affected by the value of the property. There's going to be things you can avoid, like the escrow fees and the prorated fees for property taxes and those sorts of things. But yeah, and it does vary property to property based on how complex the property is. But I would say 30% would be incredibly high.
Yeah, that feels very high. I mean, it does depend on what you're selling, because a small, fully operating estate winery is almost as complicated as selling a very large, fully operating estate winery. So those percentages will vary. I think some of the M&A investment banker shops will have sort of minimum fee thresholds in mind. So it depends what they can get for. What ultimately you sell at, that minimum threshold for them to make it worthwhile for their deal, because they only get paid really when there's deals that close. That might be $250,000 for the big guys. They don't want to do a deal unless they're going to get $1 million fee. We don't have a lot of those in Oregon, but some. Then your transaction expenses with lawyers and accountants, it can range from a simple vineyard deal to $15,000, $20,000 to, on a big winery deal, they'll be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But if you want to do one for 30%, maybe we should talk. Okay, I think we can. Luisa wants to offer Maria, sorry, what am I, bonehead? You want to just take the stage and share your experience? This is right. I also. But
you can call me anything. You can even call me my sister's name. I don't mean.
How was that? I know, where did that come from?
Thanks, you guys. It was a great panel. I feel tired all over again. We did our deal with Zapponi and Company. They're in the house, and they did an incredible job. But it was a whole other job within the other job. So, thanks for all the information. It's good. And that is a wrap. That is the close of our 2022 Oregon Wine Symposium. Thanks again for you guys coming and attending. I hope it was helpful. I hope you're going away with some good information, hopefully some inspiration. And I want to thank all of the speakers that we had here. It was amazing. Yes, thanks. And thanks again to the sponsors. I'm glad that they had a chance to share some of their information with you. So thanks to our sponsors and also to all of the trade show vendors out there and their great support. We will see you all back here in 2023 in person again at the Oregon Wine Symposium. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.